Right, well, I'd like to welcome you all today. My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network here at ODI. And I'm very happy to say that we had about over 100 people signed up to come in the room today, so I'm hoping that others will be trickling in as we carry on. And we have over 300 people in our online audience, so welcome to you as well. Today's event is going to focus on humanitarian response in urban areas. And this is also the theme of the 72nd edition of the Humanitarian Exchange, which I think you've all got a copy of on your chairs. And I think it's well known to all of you that humanitarian crises are increasingly affecting urban areas. And this is happening both directly through civil conflict, hazards like flooding or earthquakes, urban violence, or outbreaks of disease, and indirectly through hosting people fleeing these types of threats. And of the total number of displaced people, an estimated 75% of them live in urban settings. But despite this, humanitarian agencies who are used to working in rural contexts are still trying to understand how the challenges and opportunities of working in urban spaces mean that how they have to change in the way that they operate. Cities are dynamic. They rely on markets. And for humanitarian agencies, the size, diversity, and mobility of the displaced population or of urban populations can be a really daunting challenge. So the need to coordinate closely with often unfamiliar actors is another key challenge. So when humanitarians fail to recognize and work with these actors, municipalities, community groups, service providers, the private sector, governments, then we have a less than optimal response. So drawing on articles in the latest Humanitarian Exchange and their own research and experience, our panelists are going to discuss what's different about providing humanitarian assistance in urban areas and which tools and approaches can actually help to make responding to these crises more effective. But before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to remind you to put your phones on silent if you would, but feel free to tweet, and the hashtag is urban response. I'll be taking questions and comments from our audience in the room and online after we have the panel discussion, so hold your thoughts and questions until then, please. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. So on my far left is, and let's see if I can pronounce it right, Alyosha D'Onofrio. Alyosha is the Senior Director of the International Rescue Committee's Governance Technical Unit, where he oversees a team of technical advisors supporting IRC and partner programs in conflict-affected and fragile settings around the world. And he's worked with IRC since 1997, joining the agency in Bosnia as a program manager of a network of information and legal assistance centers for returning refugees. Between 1998 and 2000, he worked on facilitating the first return movements to volatile urban areas in southeastern Bosnia. And from 2000 to 2004, he was the executive director of the new IRC UK office here, before moving to DRC in 2004 as country director, where he was from 2008 to 2011. And then he was the regional director in the Africa Great Lakes program, and finally program development director for Africa before his current position. So very experienced in this area. Diane Archer, who's on my immediate left, is a senior researcher in the Humanitarian Settlements Group and team leader of Cities and Climate Change in the International Institute for Environment and Development. Diane managed the Urban Crises Learning Fund at IIED from 2015 to 2017. I think you're going to say a little bit more about that later. And her other areas of focus include urban climate change resilience, community-driven development, and inclusive urban development. And before she joined IIED, Diane worked at the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights in Bangkok. Then we were going to have Daniel Dykert join us from Kabul. I don't think that's going to be possible now because the connection, we weren't able to establish a stable connection. But we're very lucky to have with us today Rita Nimkar. And Rita, I don't have your bio in front of me, I'm sorry. But Rita actually wrote the article in the edition on a new hub hub community service in Afghanistan, which we were going to talk about today in any case. So we're actually very lucky that we've actually got Rita in the room. So I'll let you introduce yourself just briefly before we start.
I'm Rita Nimkar. I was the former regional head of programs for Central and Southwest Asia for Danish Refugee Council, and in that capacity I covered Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran. I was previously country director for CHESV in Somalia, and I worked in South Sudan and Kyrgyzstan previously. I'm really excited to actually be here to talk about practical implementation as well as theory.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rita. And then last but not least is David Sanderson. And David, there we go. No, I've got the wrong page. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, David. So David's had over 25 years of experience working across the world in development and emergencies. From 1994 to 98, he was the project manager at the Oxford Centre for Disaster Studies. And David worked for 8 years for CARE International as head of policy and subsequently regional manager for Southern and West Africa. From 2006 to 2013, he was a director at CENDEP, a centre at Oxford Brookes University, focusing on development and emergencies. And he subsequently taught at Harvard, taught and conducted research at Harvard, as well as the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. David was appointed the inaugural Judith Neilson Chair of Architecture at the University of New South Wales in February 2016, and he's just begun working on a new joint HPN-ALNAP Good Practice Review on humanitarian response in urban areas with the support of an expert advisory group. And we're expecting that publication to come out in February 2019. So look out for that. So now, we're going to spend about 50 minutes or so having a discussion with our panelists. Then I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers. And I wanted to start off with Alyosha. Alyosha, in your lead article for the Humanitarian Exchange, you pointed out that there's been a lot of talk as to what's different about providing humanitarian assistance in urban contexts. But you said that the specificity of those differences and the implications for programming have been difficult to pin down. So what do you think is distinctive about urban settings? And how should humanitarians be adapting programming approaches and engagement strategies to take these into account?
Thank you. So it's funny, when I was sort of rereading the article over the last few days, I was thinking, actually, I'm not sure that I completely dodge the bullet of the accusation I throw at everyone else, which is that oftentimes we find it really, really tricky to be specific about what we mean about doing humanitarian work in an urban setting. What's the distinctiveness of that urban humanitarianism or urban response? The reason, as I said in the article, I think we struggle with that often is that there are a bunch of accumulated bad habits, if you like, about how we work as humanitarian agencies in general, and that this involves often being quite context blind, being specifically blind to our own power relations in relation to the communities and the local stakeholders with which we work. And I think that what tends to happen is that people then project onto urban settings all these characteristics that they've often ignored in rural settings, or in a camp-based setting for that matter. So, for example, you'll hear people say, well, there's sort of local power centres and things like this. Well, there's local power centres in every village, but oftentimes these are ignored or marginalised. And so what we do is we sort of project onto the city things that sometimes are really just a reflection of our own blindness in rural contexts. So that said, then what do you pull out? So obviously there's something, you feel that it's different, right? You know that there's something distinctive about a city, an urban environment as compared to other environments. So what is that, and how do we sort of grasp that? How do we conceptualize it? The way I approached it in this article was just simply to pull out a few key terms that seemed to jump at me, that seemed to characterize the quality of relationships, of processes in urban settings. And the words that I pulled out were quantity, were density, diversity, complexity, and capacity. Are those the right words? Are they, does that encapsulate all that's different? Probably not. I mean, there are other things. One could easily have thrown out the word system or the word anonymity, there are other things there that you might want to pull out as being specifically distinctive about urban settings and specifically distinctive about how you engage with individuals and households within that setting, which kind of brings me to another problem that we have as a set of actors in an urban setting, as a set of agencies engaged in trying to support people affected by conflict, crisis, disaster, displacement. A lot of the habits that we have as institutions are based around targeting individuals or households, and that creates fundamental problems and fundamental issues when you're engaging in an urban setting where, as we said, there are more people compressed together where the density is higher, where there is a diversity of characteristics and conditions. And one of the things that we one of the sort of blind alleys we often go down, I feel, as humanitarian interveners in these settings, is to say, well, how do I find the refugee? How do I find the displaced person? How do I find that target beneficiary that I and my donor are looking for, right? And that's actually kind of the wrong question to be asking, and it's the wrong approach, in my opinion, to solving problems faced both by those individuals you think you ought to be looking for and by the people around them. So I think that's one of the kind of fundamental struggles and why we have difficulty getting to specifics a lot of the time. And so we often get involved in some very meandering conversations about how to really get to that specificity of what's important in an urban setting. And for me, what's important is really to take a step back, to not approach this as, how do I adapt my program to this urban setting, but really look at what are the problems being faced in this setting, what is affecting the wider population in this setting, what are the capacities that are available within that setting to deal with those problems, and how can I, as an outsider, support that?
And thanks, Alyosha. I guess building on that, I understand that IRC has developed successful partnerships, addressing some of these issues with municipalities dealing with urban displacement in a number of cities. And I think some of them include Kampala, Amman, and possibly Athens. Yeah. And I just wondered if you could tell us why you think such partnerships are important, and maybe how IRC has gone about creating them. Yeah. What are the key things that one has to do, or key elements of that?
Sure. So there's actually quite a few of them, and so, even spanning to such unlikely locations as Paris, Milano, Thessaloniki, sort of places we don't always talk about in a kind of humanitarian way, but equally into Nairobi, into other cities as well. And I think so. Oftentimes these partnerships have come about initially with this sense of us bringing some sort of outside technical expertise that was in demand by the city at that time due to a movement of population in most cases. And so we were able to come in as that somewhat sort of privileged outsider with the technical expertise that was in demand. But what we rapidly found is that actually there was a huge disconnect between different actors involved in that urban setting. You don't always have very joined up conversations between donors, national government, intervening actors, and the municipal government. And we found that by adopting a bit of a kind of humble and open approach to this, we were actually able to then work as a convener, as a almost like as a guide to some of the complexities of operating with the international aid and development system. And that has then, been able, off the back of that, we've really been able to form quite productive relationships that are then leading us into all sorts of different avenues and helping us to rethink how we define a programmatic intervention or what we might bring to the table. And at the same time, hoping that we're able to bring a body of knowledge, a set of relationships, and to open some doors for our partners in different municipal governments who also are interested to understand better this slightly crazy world of humanitarian actors and humanitarian development donors. So it's a two-way street, and I think there's been a good flow of information and learning across the different bodies and groups.
Yeah, and I suppose I think your colleague Samir Saliba in his article also highlighted the fact that it is about that relationship building, isn't it? Because often we want to focus on the development of a new tool, and tools are very useful and important, but on their own, they're not going to necessarily do the things that we want them to do. So that relationship building, I think, is critical.
Absolutely, and I think oftentimes there's either a sense that relationship building takes time, and I don't have time. I'm a busy humanitarian. I've got to respond. I have my log frame I have to report against, and all this sort of thing. And other times, I think there's also a barrier that comes from perhaps not knowing how to navigate one's way in relation to an urban municipal government or the systems and so on that one finds there. I mean, one of the great things, and speaking about Sam Saliba in particular, one of the great things that we've been able to do is mobilize this kind of urban planning expertise and knowledge of cities and how cities work elsewhere to then have a different type of conversation and start a different type of relationship, which is, I think, also very, very conducive to building that trust and better starting point for exchange of ideas.
Thanks. Diane, moving on to you. Diane, I wonder first, before we get into, I've got a question or two for you, but before we get into that, I wonder if you could just tell the group a bit about some of the research that has informed this humanitarian exchange.
Thanks, Wendy. So as you mentioned before, we've just completed a 3-year program called the Urban Crises Learning Fund, funded by DFID. And that has generated around 80 different pieces of, or different publications, briefings, research papers, toolkits, some of which are outside for you to pick up, and also has informed some of the papers in this special issue as well of Humanitarian Exchange. We had 4 separate calls for proposals, which generated research around the world, really, in Asia, Africa, Middle East, also Latin America, on a variety of topics. And we also had 2 learning consortia, one led by IRC with NRC and World Vision, and one led by Habitat for Humanity with Oxfam, ODI, and UCL. Which separately, the IRC one developed some tools and guidance notes for use of these tools specific to urban areas. And the Habitat for Humanity Consortia investigated using Haiti and Bangladesh as 2 case study countries, various approaches to accountability to affected populations, but also thematic issues like water and sanitation. So that's in the special issue as well.
Thanks for that. Diane, humanitarian agencies, and I think Alyosha's already mentioned this, they've started to recognize the need to do things differently in urban settings. But as we know, responses still fall short. So how do you see the relationship between humanitarian agencies and the local population? I mean, is now the time to develop better links between humanitarian and development interventions, for example?
Thanks, Wendy. I think definitely there is a realization now that there is a need for better linkages or between humanitarian and development interventions when we're looking at urban contexts, and also that this provides an entry point for resilience thinking, so for implementing forward-looking interventions that prepare for the best possible recovery and best possible future post-crisis. It's also a chance, I suppose, to try and address the various global agendas, the Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, the climate change agreements. Basically, there is the opportunity to build local capacities to address these various international agreements through humanitarian interventions as well as development interventions, and particularly so if we do them hand in hand. So I suppose there are three things perhaps that humanitarian agencies working in urban settings could do when taking a more forward-looking perspective, which is firstly to recognize that they are operating in places that often already have existing deficiencies even before the crisis in question. So around the world we have 1 billion people living in informal settlements. If there is then the added pressure of a displaced population or a major disaster, that creates a whole different scale of need as well. We also need to recognize the potential for future shocks and stresses, including climate change. So in the response, are we making sure that households that get relocated aren't put in a place that means that they're vulnerable to sea level rise 10 years down the line, for example? And I think we also need to recognize that urban areas don't exist on their own. They're linked to their hinterland in terms of flows of people, but also flows of goods and natural resources. They rely on natural resources outside the city as well. So bearing all of that in mind, I think building on what Alyosha said, complexity, diversity, capacity that exists in cities, I think we can make the most of those by taking a more collective approach and building on past urban development experience, particularly the approach of area-based approaches has many similarities to slum upgrading approaches that have been applied quite successfully around the world through processes of participation and co-production to ensure more integrated urban development. So there are lots of opportunities there for area-based approaches to build on that type of experience in the past. And this also helps local affected populations to develop their capacities in various ways, to build social capital, to be empowered in negotiating with different actors in the urban area, to develop skills in construction or managing finances, and also just the process of engaging in reconstruction or supplying services and negotiating with the state can be a process of rehabilitation after a crisis. So I think there is definitely a need, as Alyosha said, for humanitarians to understand the local landscape of multiple providers, both the formal sector and the informal sector, for example, in provision of water, provision of housing, and so on. And how can humanitarian interventions complement these rather than displace them? And at the same time ensure that their interventions support urban planning approaches, which often takes time. So how to integrate a humanitarian intervention with existing urban development plans, regional plans, climate change assessments, climate change action plans. There's scope here for the humanitarian agencies to provide technical support to do this hand in hand with the intervention that addresses the crises. And I think as well, humanitarian agencies are well placed to play an advocacy role to ensure a more inclusive urban recovery and development approach. So municipalities might be more accountable to their electorate, whereas humanitarians agencies might be more focused on addressing the needs of particularly vulnerable populations such as displaced or refugees. So there's a role here for humanitarian agencies to advocate for a more inclusive approach, and also applying approaches like area-based approaches can also help address this these divisions or potential divisions by focusing on an area rather than individuals, as it were.
Right. Thank you, Diane. I'm actually going to move on, I think, to David, because we've mentioned area-based approaches quite a lot. And so I'm wondering whether we can David's got a couple of slides, I think, that you wanted to put up there. And I mean, as I think Diane and both Alyosha mentioned, we know that area-based approaches are being used more and more. And a lot of people, you've highlighted 10 principles for enacting post-disaster urban area-based approaches, and I think it would be really helpful if you could go through those for us and tell us how they've been used in the sector.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you for being here. I think you summed it up, Diane, that area-based approaches fundamentally are taking the best of what we understand from developmental work, working in planning and design and spatial awareness relating to towns and cities. So I think you said it well, talking about villages, and we have a rich heritage of working mostly in rural settings. I'd say ABAs comes from a heritage of working in urban areas, so 30, 40 years or more at the very least. And so the summary is, the takeaway I'd hope is that we're learning from what's gone on forever, because essentially post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, you could say, is a developmental issue, especially if it's with low-income, more marginalised communities, such as the neighbourhoods you mentioned, Diane. I just want to share two diagrams. This, in fact, is from a different paper, but the point here is it's people in the centre. I mean, it's good mainstream development stuff with people and local governance, and they're in the centre, and I suppose it's slightly cheeky to then contrast it with the cluster model. And the cluster system is a good system. However, many, not least IRC, would comment that the cluster system is not working very well when it comes to urban. So the sort of slight deceit of this is, and conceit, I suppose, is to pop people in the middle and sectors are around. And the idea of scaling up, one of the problems, as we know, in urban areas is the isolated project. That's very nice in that neighbourhood, and a lot's gone on, but the one next door has nothing. And so definitional sort of thinking that we added in this piece of work, which in fact came from the project that Diane mentioned from the IRC one as well, relates to adding this idea of scale up. And the issue is who scales up and how. And of course, good developmental thinking is local ownership and not owned by the agency. The last thing you want is that we did it, they did it, as opposed to we own it, and all those issues of ownership and all those things. If I could have the second diagram, please. So these are the 10 principles. I suspect I'd bore you to death if I went through all 10 of them. But what we tried to do in this piece of research, in fact, we interviewed a number of people, really experienced people, all of them except one who also brought a lot to it, 25 to 30 years worth of experience, working all over the world doing all this. And we tried to collect what they were saying and add to all the literature and all those things. And we came out with 10 principles, I suppose, tied to, as best we could, the project management cycle as we have it, traditional as though that is, and just picking out some, well, I was going to say in no particular order, but to start with the first one. Multi-sector assessments. It's no surprise to anybody that we should be multi-sectoral, and that works as well for rural as well as urban, of course. But the argument is, the summary for all this is cities are really complicated, complex, as much as what you don't see is happening as what you do, in fact, way more. And so we need to combine and organise and set up working collaboratively across sectors. Our sectoral approaches aren't fit for purpose when it comes to the complexity of people's lives. There'll be another summary, and I'm happy to talk about that and point to the background is why we say that. Number 2, focus on location. Well, they're area-based approaches. I suppose the point there is not so much, again, the sectors and what we deliver, but if you like, what the demand is. Recognising as much as one can the complexity of real life, where it's not about the helpless victim and we're stuck and here it is. It's actually getting on with life and these things happen. Diane mentioned the resilience agenda. I think resilience plays very well to this, how we see more the totality of lives, and we don't see the isolated person, the victim, which, of course, people who survive disasters aren't. Thirdly, realistic timeframes. The paper also in the Humanitarian Exchange, written by our colleagues at CRS.
Concern,
and linked to CRS in Haiti.
Yes.
Sorry, with Concern, a really nice paper. They talk about as one of their 4 conclusions, it takes time. No surprise there, they were talking about 2, 5, 10, 30-year timeframes. That's the reality of the city, and as we all know, the project cycle of donors, for reasons that are not bad or wrong per se, are often shorter. So how do you use your aid as an investment for longer-term recovery? What is it you put in? And cities are places of commerce and markets and competition. What are your investments is a way of seeing it. Number 4, people-centered approaches. Whose reality counts? The Robert Chambers thinking from 23 years ago now, whose reality counts. It's not the agency, it's people themselves. And of course, the quicker you give away interventions and don't own them, and ideally never own them in the first place, is the point where you get to some of the ideas about longer term investments. Working with other structures, of course, they're cities. So there are gatekeepers, there are gangs, there are groups you never see. There are, in tribal societies, a whole kind of chieftaincy systems, things we never talk about nor understand, and never will probably, but at least the recognition these exist. Collaborating sectors and programs, of course, coming back to the idea that we're always working collaboratively and never separately. I'm whistling through this, but there's more in the exchange which summarize these things. A really dull but important one, nimble internal systems. Those we interviewed were invariably from larger organizations. HR, finance, have their own missions and needs and appropriateness, and of course, who would say anything other than that's vital? But the argument here is that ABAs need a different approach, that agencies need to think differently, because this is long-term developmental thinking, actually, and HR and finance and other functions have a critical role to play in aligning itself to flexibility. And that brings me on to adaptive management, some of the work that Ben Ramlingen and Chambers again are doing at IDS. Adaptive management, really interesting, that we mentioned the log frame, which we all love, and Marmite moment of the log frame. I actually think they're quite good. I'm sorry to tell you. But adaptive management is trying to go one step further about flexible systems, about open-endedness, about being more responsive and less fixed, which we all know for decades is important. But if we're thinking in an urban area where Thursday is different to Wednesday afternoon, again, we need to think and plan in those ways. And there's a lot of work going on at IDS on this whole adaptive management world, and it's really interesting. Final two, planning for scale-up. It's no good if it remains a little project. We were discussing this, and there's a cost there. So again, it should not be for a big agency to be doing that. It's about local ownership and investing for long-term recovery, where you leave as quickly as possible, in inverted commas, or have a long-term engagement before or after as part of the long game of engaging. And then finally, the contribution, not attribution. Again, a reflection. The city is so complicated, and this is the work of Roger Few and Vivian Walden, been doing this forever, that actually you measure what's the contribution an agency makes as opposed to the individual measurable. And that's a step change for donors as well, to be, for not wrong reasons, of course, tracking money, and we're in an age here and in this country where again, for good reasons, we need to know that, and at the same time in urban areas, letting go is a dangerous phrase, especially ODI, your letting go report, but measuring in different ways, what's your contribution, because it's the collective.
Thank you, David. I think we've got Daniel on the line now from Kabul, is that right? Or he was. Have I missed my opportunity?
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi Daniel, welcome, and I'm sorry that we couldn't connect earlier with you.
No, I'm sorry, I had some issues, yeah.
No, that's no problem at all. Since I seem to struggle to find my biographic notes, I wonder if you could just introduce yourself briefly to the audience here. I'm going to ask Rita a question first, and then come on to you to talk about the impact of the project since 2017. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right, sure. So my name is Daniel. I'm currently working as the Country Hub Program Coordinator for Danish Refugee Council here in Afghanistan. And I've been working here with them for the last 4 months. And Rita, who was here previously, was also working on this program, so she can also provide some insight into the work that we've been doing here.
My first question, and Rita actually wrote an article for the Exchange on this project. We know that the urban areas in Afghanistan have changed hugely in the last, recent years. And in Kabul, I understand the population's grown by 4.5% annually between 2010 and 2015. So this has put enormous pressure on the urban infrastructure and employment. It's prompted a significant outflow of the wealthier, more educated Afghans. And I know DRC has implemented this interesting new programming approach in urban centers in Afghanistan to try to address the needs of the long-term displaced. And I just wondered if you could tell us what's different about this approach.
Sure. It might be easiest if I actually go back to how we started.
Sure.
Because we started by taking a look at the programming that we were doing in Kabul and looking at what the strengths and disadvantages were. And we found, as Aloysia said, that we were extremely tied to log frames. We did cash programming that was designed to target the most vulnerable people coming in from areas that had been taken over by armed opposition groups. They were the poorest of the poor. We gave them enough to survive 1 month, and that was it. In another corner of the city, we did programming designed to support general protection outcomes. And in a third corner of the city, we did programming that was targeted a little bit more at the longer-term displaced and also those who might consider emigrating outside of Kabul. The links between the programs, to be honest, were not strong. So in terms of what that means in terms of impact, it means we're not doing what we can. So we stepped back to say, okay, what's happening with people and how can we do it differently? An urban area, or Kabul in particular, was basically in the center of a two-way crunch. So people were coming in from areas that had been affected by conflict. People were going out because of the pressure on infrastructure and the opportunities that were elsewhere. Within the flow of people, we as DRC wanted to see where we could place ourselves in order to be useful to people, basically. So the first thing we tried to do was see where people went. When people came in after a conflict, the first thing they did was register with the government authorities. Then they moved out to peri-urban areas where they did their best to make a living. People closer to the center were more likely to be wealthy and were more likely to emigrate abroad. People further out were more likely to not be well off and to be struggling just to overcome the consequences of having moved after a conflict. In terms of what that meant the DRC could do in a combined way, honestly, it was difficult. You look at all this movement and you say, well, what am I supposed to do about this? And so we figured that the best thing we could do was follow where people were. So if people were coming in from a conflict, we could set up something close to the first place they went. That was the government offices. At that same center, we could attract people who were better off and who were looking for increased opportunities. For the people who went out to urban areas and who settled in urban areas, that's the most vulnerable, most affected by conflict, we could set up smaller scale community centers, basically. And in all of the centers, we could provide all of our services. So basically, if you went to a center, whether it was in the center of town or outside, you could access a wide range of services, and it wasn't a kind of a situation of us sticking to our log frame. It was a question of us saying, this is what we have, what do you need? And if you need more, how can we get it? So that was the principle that we started off with. So the idea was to say, where are people moving? Where do urban areas fit within this movement? And where can we as a humanitarian actors put ourselves? The first thing was that required stepping back from what we were currently doing. It required throwing the log frames out of the window, at least for a day. After that, after the concept was developed together with all the program managers, honestly, it took a long time to convince donors of things. And it took a long time to set up a system that was adequately flexible. One of the things, we had quite a bit of luck with donors, because once we started setting up, we found that what was happening in the centers wasn't always what we expected. The Kabul was a typical example. We had a child-friendly space that we anticipated would be used by displaced people when they came to a center. We anticipated they would drop off their kids, go to a government office, get register at the government office, and come back for their kids. But to our surprise, we found host communities basically using the child-friendly center as a nursery. Now, normally in day-to-day humanitarian operations, you get panicked. I'm not going to be able to reach my targets. What am I going to do? This really sucks. But actually what we did was we went back to the donor and we said, this isn't meeting the need we thought it would, but it's meeting another need that was not addressed that actually could be equally important and is equally important if you want to address migration as a whole in Kabul. And in that respect, we were lucky. We had donors that listened to us and let us keep on going. At a certain point in time, we found that we placed too much emphasis on the hub in the center. We needed to also start doing more in peri-urban areas where there were people who were more vulnerable, and we needed to change our approach. So if I'm not mistaken, and this is where I think I should switch to Daniel, we're looking now at basically changing the emphasis more to peri-urban areas and away from central centers. But basically, the difference in it was stepping back from what we're doing, trying to think about where people are going, and trying to think about what we can do along their route.
Thanks for that, Rita. Daniel, I wonder if you wanted to add to that and maybe talk a bit about some of the lessons that have been learned sort of a year on from this approach having been fully implemented.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's, as Rita said, it's been challenging, and it's definitely been a learning process. Our community centers are primarily placed in urban and peri-urban areas. And what we've noticed there is that because you have so many different fragmented populations within these urban areas, community acceptance becomes even more important in setting up these community centers and getting people interested in coming to the centers and accessing the services. And also, access becomes more of a technical issue. So a lot of people, they would travel. Some communities might be in the immediate vicinity of the community centers, but there's also people that are further out that are also interested in the services. And for them to be able to access these centers, often the cost of that transportation can be a barrier for them to come and access these centers. So that becomes a big sort of consideration when we're trying to set up, these different sites. Also, outreach and coordination take on a very different set of challenges. For example, in these sort of urban settings, you've got a lot more actors and opportunities that you're essentially competing with. So it's difficult to get the attention of communities and to keep that attention. A lot of the activities that we provide are very much focused on information sharing, awareness raising. We also provide direct services, but those are often limited due to limited resources, and there we have to be more selective. But I think one thing where we managed to be quite successful is to convey the community centers as a place that anyone can access, and as a place that primarily provides information, referrals, and a place where people can come to access other service providers and even get information about how to get support from the government. So I think that's worked quite well. Another sort of key learning point has been that because we're working in a setting, we're working in a protracted crisis setting. So you have populations that have been displaced almost 5 years ago, but then you also have new populations that are being displaced to these areas, on a regular basis. So it's a setting. We're not exactly working in an emergency setting, but we're also not working in a development setting. We're somewhere in between. And it's hard to sort of figure out, what kind of support should we be focusing on. So some of the activities that we provide are more targeted towards new displacements, but then some of the other services that we provide also look at the more protracted displaced populations. But all of this, it comes with a cost. So setting up these community centers is a very expensive process, and it takes time for people to become aware of these community centers, to access them. So that impact, it takes a long time to develop. So that's something we're sort of struggling with and trying to address as we keep working on this program.
Daniel, thanks for that. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with the government. How do you work with the government? At what level, and do you think their engagement they've been sufficiently engaged, or you've been sufficiently engaged with them?
So from the get-go of this program, we actually placed the first centers right next to the government, and so that they would have a direct link to the community center, and they would refer people to that community center. This hasn't happened very strongly. So what a lot of
So the government was that?
so this is the Ministry of Refugees and Repatriation.
Right, thanks, sorry. Go ahead.
So this hasn't happened that well. So a lot of our beneficiaries and referrals are coming from other sources. And in fact, because we've got some of these centers located closer to the ministry, we're not actually close to a lot of the communities that we're actually trying to serve. So that's a challenge that we're trying to address now. In terms of other coordination with the government, one challenge that I've noticed is that in designing sort of smaller community initiatives and trying to target communities in the sort of peri-urban areas, you also sort of face a challenge of which ministry is sort of the responsible governing body for that area, because there's also not a clear definition for which areas are considered rural and which areas are considered urban. So often we faced issues where we'd actually create competition between the ministry responsible for the rural areas and the ministry responsible for the urban areas, because they're all trying to get that support. So those kinds of challenges have been difficult, and we try to work with all the ministries to ensure that we're targeting the most vulnerable populations.
Thanks. So Rita, do you have anything to add to that?
Just one brief addition, which is about implementation of the same project in different contexts, or similar concepts in different contexts. DRC is in the initial phases of setting up similar programming in Iran. And the relationship with the government, honestly, it's a night and day difference between Afghanistan and Iran. In Iran, the government is actually actively looking to start up similar centers in locations where they already have quite a lot of activities, and they're looking to develop synergies, and they're looking for them to do the outreach to Afghans and for DRC and other similar NGOs to teach them how to do it. So it's a nice sustainability measure sometimes, but it's not at all like that in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, both the low capacity of the government and the challenges involved in having so many NGOs interact with the government means that the relationship is a lot less strong and it's a lot harder to create similar linkages.
Did anybody else want to comment on this particular from the panel? I think this is a really interesting example because, what I really appreciated about your article too was how honest you were about the challenges that you faced and, outlining how you moved to the sort of thinking and the position that you're in now. And I think that's what's really helpful about the Humanitarian Exchange and something we struggle actually to get authors to do. Most want to talk about just how wonderful their programs were and how well they worked, and trying to get people to talk about the things that that didn't go so well and how they had to adapt them and what they didn't understand to begin with is quite a challenge. So thank you for that. Diane.
Sure. I found it really interesting to hear about the community centres and the role that they play in providing access to information to displaced populations, for example. And I think the research that IID has been involved in has shown that often refugee groups themselves that are more established can also play that role in certain contexts. So, for example, in Kampala, which receives quite a lot of different refugee populations from Somalia, Congo, also IDPs from Acholi area. The Somali community plays quite a dominant role in sort of receiving new arrivals and helping them get set up with a local business and so on. Similarly, the Congolese refugees, when they arrive, there are Congolese church groups that help support them and have centers that provide support and so on. So I wonder if that's also an entry point in places where such communities exist, where humanitarian agencies can support these existing mechanisms that might be quite self-sustaining as well in the longer term. Or other research in Delhi as well, looking at refugees from Afghanistan Afghanistan showed that church spaces played a very important role as a place for refugee communities to gather, especially in a setting where they felt quite marginalized because they were not from the dominant religious groups, and that the churches were safe spaces where they felt they could have community activities, and so they received support from NGOs as well.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess just to sort of follow from that, my initial reaction was very similar, but flipped around the other way, was just to sort of say, well, what were people doing under other circumstances? So in the absence of there being a centre in a peri-urban area or wherever, how were people accessing information? What kind of networks were they building anyway? And again, was there something that you could build from with that?
Okay, so basically the way it works for people coming into Kabul is that people travel in groups. And there's a group, there's elders. The elders appoint a representative to go to government agencies to file a petition to try to get support. And that one person is also the person who brings back information, because he's the representative of the community elsewhere. For all intents and purposes, what that means is that person's a gatekeeper. If you have a good gatekeeper, fantastic, nothing to worry about. But if you don't have a good gatekeeper, then not so good. It doesn't work so well in terms of outcomes for the average person in the community. It was basically a gatekeeper model. And even if you take a look at mixed migration flows for Afghans, it's something similar. People travel in groups, and there's one person who often does the representing.